content that we're about to send your direction. However, it is my understanding that we have a young birthday girl here today. I'm sorry I didn't bring any ice cream or anything for you. Should have, right? So, Miss Kay Tricky is enjoying a birthday today, and it would only be appropriate to celebrate that by us singing happy birthday to her, right? Okay, here we go. Woo. Well, you know, you can own that. It was Lily who tipped us off. But she did a good job because we needed to be tipped off. I mean, it's your birthday, and here you are choosing to have dinner with us and Bible study with us. Well, we were assuming that because, right? We sort of assumed that was the case. We always assume that. So, there's a couple of things going on. I'm trying to limit the number of trains of thought that I keep shooting your direction. And my son told me they started him some medication, but he said that he's got this thing where he's always working on about 10 different projects in his head at the same time, or 30. And I said, I wonder if he got that from me. Because same way with me. And so sometimes I have trouble narrowing down to a single train of thought, a single direction, and I might jump the tracks and go over onto something else, but sort of come back to that one. And I'm trying not to do a whole lot of track jumping with this. I'm trying to start and end on the same track. And admittedly, I don't always do that on my Bible studies. But I've got a little bit more time on that than, say, Sunday morning. I've got a little bit more freedom with my content and everything. And so if I decide to add something in, I just jump over there and pull that and do that. Y'all probably figured that out by now. There's usually a few trains of thought all going side by side anyway. So first thing I'd like to point out to you is I started a kind of a family tree organizational chart or graphic organizer for Jesus Family. It is not complete. I will add some more information to that for you later on. So before I jump into the rest of this and get on a totally different tangent, does anybody have questions about that partial family tree chart that I've given you?
Just a comment that I take with Mark. There's a line between Mary and Martha that probably doesn't belong there.
I think it was intentional. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are all three siblings.
Yeah. But there's a line between the two of them, between Mary and Martha.
Oh, I bet I did put an extra line because it was the line going over them. I think you're right. Thank you. I needed to look at it to see that. Correct. That line, excellent. The line that goes between Martha and Mary the Magdalene, that line does not belong. They're connected by the line over them as siblings. Yeah. Good catch there, Loyal. Thank you. Yeah, okay. So, Joseph has two siblings that I'm aware of. There may be others, but two that I'm aware of. One of those is Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other one is Salome, the other sister. It's right there on your chart. Notice those are connected as siblings, as are Mary, Martha, and Lazarus connected as siblings, with the exception of that extra line that I had there that does not belong. That will be corrected on your updated when you get next week. Yes, Wes?
Is that Salome that danced for
It's a different Salome. Yes. So, on the half-siblings of Jesus, I put asterisks by the ones that are actually named in Scripture. There's a couple of places they're named. I'm probably missing at least one sister. And the reason I say that is I listed Miriam and Martha as sisters who are not named in the Bible, but the passage of Scripture that names his brothers there, half-brothers, let's go with, says, and all his sisters are here too. So all is more than one. All is usually more than two, or they would have said both his sisters, right? Unless there's a translating thing going on there that I haven't dug up yet. I haven't looked into the word study on that. However, it would seem to indicate more than two sisters there. I've only got two names. I'm still digging on that. Recently learned the youngest brother, Amos, died not at birth, but during infancy. He had an illness and that took his life. So there's your beginning of the family tree. Maybe slightly different than what you have seen in the past. And an acknowledgement I'll add in, most of the sources that you look up on this will put Joseph, our tin man, Joseph of Arimathea, as the brother to Heli rather than the son of Heli, therefore making him the uncle of Mary rather than the brother of Mary. I dispute that, and I've got other sources on this as well. And basically it comes down to this. The earlier your source, the more likely it is to show him as Mary's brother. The later your source, the more likely it is to show him as Mary's uncle. And again, I'd mentioned that the Council of Ephesus, what was it, 431 or 32 AD, some of the teachings that were introduced made it uncomfortable for them to say that Mary had siblings, and therefore they tried to shift some of those things. Mostly historical records that have been influenced by the Vatican since the 5th century will show Joseph as the brother to Heli rather than brother to Mary. But you get the earlier source, and it clearly will show Joseph as Mary's brother. Not only that, the great historian and physician Luke said Heli had a son named Joseph that people accepted by custom as the father of Jesus. That was not the guy Mary was married to, obviously. But that has been the explanation that has been rendered on that again and again and again, commentary after commentary, and it just doesn't hold water, doesn't fly. You've already got the Joseph genealogy, and this is not it. So anyway, getting off track, tonight's lesson I'm just calling family ties, and we're getting into a different set of family ties, which will require a couple more family trees, somewhat disconnected from the one I've just given you. So I want to start off with a little bit of scripture on this. Just before Jesus ascended, he called his disciples, followers together, and gave the Great Commission. It's like this. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Am I getting louder here? I seem really loud. "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." And so Jesus had given this great commission to go into the world, take the gospel to everyone. And his closest followers were the ones who took that the most direct and seriously, and we find they actually did that. We're going to get into a little bit of that in tonight's study. Back in John chapter 11, therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What is it Jesus has done that they're all upset about? Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus from the dead. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. This is serious. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. That's quite a leap, but that's what they said, what they believed. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. You see what he's getting at here? He's like, we're going to put a stop to this, guys. But it was also considered prophetic that he said this in fulfillment of earlier prophecy and prophesying this. It says it here. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Now, there's a little bit more between the lines before I proceed on here. I just want to point out, and when I point out some of these things, my intent with that is to sort of prompt you to look for these sort of things when you read across them in the Bible and ask the questions that cause you to explore and find out why. Let's read this, verse 51 and 52 again. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. Notice here in 52, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. Question, everybody. Who are the scattered children of God that are being referred to here? What do y'all think? Is this the Gentiles who are going to come to Jesus in the preaching of the gospel? Apparently these, just my read on this would say, people that were historically considered the children of God, like the Jews were, but are scattered. Who can you think of that this, to whom this might refer? I almost ended with proposition, but I didn't. But are there really any lost tribes? No, you're on track there. Yes.
It says he's prophesying, so is he talking about like the Israelites that came back to Israel after World War II?
Well, could be, but we're looking at some who are scattered at this time already, I believe. So prior to Babylon defeating the kingdom of Judah or the southern kingdom, and this was under the will of God, and they had their time in exile, came back and everything. But prior to that, the northern 10 tribes had been defeated, and many of them taken away into exile by what nation? Assyria. Let me ask you a question. What is the bigger deal? The 2 tribes of the south going into 70 years exile in Babylon, or the 10 tribes of the north being exiled by Assyria and never coming back? So where did these people go? I'll tell you one thing. When Joseph of Arimathea came along trading ores in the British Islands, all the miners there and all the smelters there were Hebrew people. And even in the 20th century, the ruins of the old smelting houses, locals still refer to those as the Jew houses. How did this happen? They had been there for hundreds of years before the first century when Joseph came along trading ores. And when Paul did his missionary journeys, he went up across Asia Minor and parts of Europe. And every town he chose to go to, what was in that town? Where did he meet with people and speak? A synagogue. Well, how could there be synagogues in all these Gentile nations and cities? So maybe these lost tribes aren't really lost at all. They're just scattered, like this says. Remember at one point when Jesus commissions the 70, he says, don't go among the Gentiles. Go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Did he not? Now, so the nation Israel was considered two houses, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. The house of Israel had been scattered since the Assyrian conquest, which was, 200 years prior to the Babylonian conquest of the house of Judah. Go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Where was he sending them? Well, where did they go? That's a good way of answering the question, isn't it? And so this great commission that we just read, connecting it down to what we see here of going to the scattered children of God to bring them together, and bringing them together is not necessarily a physical gathering in my understanding, it's bringing them together in the church. The new thing that God has brought about. I can get into a whole lot more. We can actually track the travelings and the migration of those northern tribes northward and then westward in many cases, but also leaving behind some population at all of those places for the most part too. And you can discover a lot that way. Just like when Jeremiah left with the two daughters of Zedekiah at the Babylonian conquest. And he first of all goes to Egypt, Ethiopia, but then where does he go with them? Interesting thing, isn't it? Now, again, a disputed teaching, but the daughters married royalty of Hebrew descent, and they did not find them in Israel. Another teaching, another time, we'll get to that. But look at what's going on here, the stark prophecy that's going on, and the clarity of what's being said about the children of God, the people of Israel. It's all right there. Again, what I keep saying, it's hidden in plain sight. It's not really hidden. What makes it hidden in plain sight is we already know, therefore we don't look to discover. We don't look to discover the things we already know. But if we forget that we already know, we might catch ourselves looking, and we might catch ourselves finding something too, right? That's kind of how I'm approaching this. A persecution begins in Israel. First of all, there is Stephen, who is a deacon in the church in Jerusalem. Does there anybody remember the story on Stephen? Okay, let's go and we'll read at least part of that, okay, in Acts chapters 6 and 7. Believe it or not, this all connects together pretty nicely. It's all this. We haven't jumped tracks yet, I think. Okay, so I'm coming in. I'm just going to kind of swoop in here at the end of Acts chapter 6. Just to get a little piece of this. Verse 7 in Acts chapter 6. The word of God increased, the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. Again, a great company of who were obedient to the faith? Did the church have priests? No, so who were these people? They would have been the Levites, correct? who became followers of Christ. Okay, verse 8. Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and miracles among the people. Then there arose certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the Libertines, and Cyrenians, and the Alexandrians, and of them of Cilicia and of Asia, disputing with Stephen. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. Then they suborned men which said, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and came upon him and caught him and brought him to the council. And they set up false witnesses which said, this man won't cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered us. And all that sat in the council, looking steadfastly on him, saw his face as it had been the face of an angel. Then the high priest said, are these things so? And he said, men, brethren, fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. So he goes through and gives them the whole lesson of God calling Abraham, the whole story of the patriarchs, the Exodus, the time in Egypt and all of that, okay? So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Let me see how much I can skip. He's given them a long, long history lesson. And so, let's pick up in verse 52. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain them, which showed before the coming of the just one, of whom you have been now the betrayers and murderers. See what he's telling them. He gave them the whole history lesson from Abraham all the way down to the current time. And then he says, and by the way, which of these prophets have you and your ancestors, your fathers, not persecuted? And now you become the betrayers and murderers of the just one, or the Messiah, who have received the law by the disposition of angels, but have not kept it. And when they heard these things, they were cut to their heart. They gnashed on him with their teeth. But he, Stephen, being full of the Holy Ghost, looked up steadfastly into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing on the right hand of God. And he said, behold, look, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. And they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears, and they ran upon him with one accord. And they cast him out of the city and stoned him. The witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet, whose name was Saul. And they stoned Stephen, calling upon God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And he kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And when he had said this, he fell asleep, and Saul was consenting unto his death. And we know that Saul, which we know is the Apostle Paul, had a special commission from the council in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, to persecute, to torture, to get confessions, to wreak havoc among the believers, the followers of Christ. And he was doing that. Notice it says Saul was consenting to his death, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. They were all scattered abroad through the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And so this is not too long after the crucifixion, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Christ. A lot happens in these next few short years there. Acts chapter 9, we read a little bit more about Saul and his conversion, starting at the beginning of verse 9. Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues there, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shone around about him a light from heaven. He fell to the earth and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I'm Jesus, whom you persecute. It's hard for you to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what will you have me to do? And the Lord said, arise and go to the city, and it will be told you what you must do. This was Paul's Damascus Road salvation experience. And notice what he had been doing just prior to that. The stoning of Stephen, all of these sort of things. But notice, let me back up. He went to the high priest and asked of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues. Okay, so his authority is coming from where? High priest. Okay, now, the high priest there really wanted to wipe out everyone influential in the Christian faith at that time. As you said, we saw earlier what they feared with all of this. And for some time, our friend Joseph had been able to protect many of the people that they were trying to kill or harm. It was finding places to hide them, to shelter them. And Joseph, the Tin Man, that Joseph, was, as I understand it, he was a pretty good friend of Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate was sympathetic to him, plus they had, business. Joseph, as a Roman officer, the nobilis dicurio, which was the manager of the mining districts throughout the Roman Empire. So he had a lot of status with Rome, therefore with Pontius Pilate. However, about 36 AD, Pontius Pilate got a new assignment and left Jerusalem. That's when things started getting really bad. That's when you see the stoning of Stephen takes place, the continued persecutions under Saul, and James was killed, if you remember this. James, the half-brother of Jesus, who was pastor or a leader there in the church. Y'all knew that, right? Read in Acts chapter 15 when they are coming back with the big questions about if Gentiles can be followers of Christ and what they must do. They got to keep all the law of Moses. Who was it who rendered the final decision on that? It was James. It was James. Yeah. But not long after that, James was killed. So here's what happened. I'll tell you the story first, and then I'll try to give you a little bit of history. Joseph was very comfortable at sea. And why would I say he was very comfortable at sea? Those of you who've been these lessons, why would we say that? He had ships. He traveled all over the place. He sailed the Mediterranean. He sailed down through the Indian Ocean. He no telling where all the guy had been, but we know he had been all through up around the European coast. He had been down around India, and of course that would bring him around close to southern Africa. I'm not sure where all else he may have gone, but the guy traveled a lot. Okay, and so here I'm not going to jump tracks. I'm going to put a little aside in here. One of the things that really opens up your understanding is when you realize how well traveled the wealthy people in the ancient world really were. How well informed they were about current events in other parts of the world and knew very quickly things that were going on. We have no idea of that. We're middle class people. We've grown up middle class. It's only been a short snippet of history where there's even been a middle class. In the first century, how big a middle class did you have? There wasn't any middle class. Either you were extremely poor and destitute, or you were extremely wealthy and very privileged. The gospel that's been taught to me all my life was that Jesus was among the extremely poor and destitute. And his family was. And yet, as soon as I started opening up a little bit of history, I had to say, there's absolutely no way they could be extremely poor and destitute. They were the wealthiest people around. And consequently, extremely knowledgeable about things going on in other places, even arranging meetings in other parts of the world and showing up and meeting one another. How do you suppose they did that without cell phones, without telegraph? think about it. They had other ways of carrying word and communicating and knowing what was going on. I'd mentioned one of Zedekiah's daughters ended up marrying a ambassador who was of Hebrew descent, but it was visiting and keeping an eye on what was happening in Jerusalem from Northern Europe, and ended up marrying one of Zedekiah's daughters. Why? He was there observing because these Hebrew people scattered all over the rest of the world cared what was happening in Israel and in Jerusalem specifically. And it was not that unusual for someone there of royalty to connect with one of these other ambassadors who was Hebrew from their background and end up married. So that aside, Joseph here is comfortable at sea. He has traded, he has sailed, he has multiple ships that he has traveled in pretty much all of his life, so he's good at that. But after Pontius Pilate is removed, they crack down, and this is when the scattering really begins in earnest, the persecution that's referred to there in Acts. And they exile Joseph. The record from Cardinal Baronius, who's written on this, and actually this in the Vatican Library, and he's quoting from earlier sources. But the big story was Joseph and a small company of others were placed in a boat without sails and without oars, and they towed that boat far out into the Mediterranean. And with the expectation they would probably just die, but they were certainly being exiled, and they couldn't say they killed him, okay? I mean, the one guy's a Roman official, for crying out loud, right? As it turns out, this boat they're on, the best I can track it is they somehow managed to hit land in North Africa. Joseph, through his contacts there, arranged passage on a real boat to Gaul or France. And when they arrived there in the south of France, there at Gaul, Philip, the evangelist, that we read about in Acts chapter 8, by the way, Philip the evangelist and a pretty large company meet them there in France at Gaul. And there's also another group there. It's a pretty sizable entourage from the king down in Cornwall, Glastonbury, King Caradoctus, or Caradoc as some would know him. And of course, Joseph had some familiarity with them. He had traded in that land. That was his primary source for the tin and copper when he was all about that. And the offer is for him to come and share the gospel there in the British Isles. And there he is offered land. He is offered several other things. And in my understanding, in some of the British records, the tax-free land that he was offered and given by the king at that point is still recorded on the books there. Pretty amazing. I don't know what size of parcel a hide of land is, but it was like 40 hides of land. It was a couple acres each or something like that, but to be tax-free. And of course, on that land is where Glastonbury Abbey sits today. But there's a lot more to the story than that. Here's what happened, though. Cardinal Baronius says, in that year, the party mentioned was exposed to the sea in a vessel without sails or oars. The vessel drifted finally to Marseille, where they were saved. From Marseille, Joseph and his company passed into Britain, and after preaching the gospel there, he died. The reason for the boat having been set adrift was that the Jews wanted to get rid of these Christians, but couldn't get away with murder. Did I list the people that were believed to be on the boat together there? Yeah. Another lesson, I'll get into all the people. There's a few there that you recognize that you would expect would be together. And again, as I mentioned, Philip the evangelist is there waiting for them when they arrive in France. Okay, just for the sake of conversation, this has nothing to do with Bible or theology or anything else other than just how do people do things, all right? How did Philip and the company with him meet Joseph and his company when they arrived in France? How did they even know? Give me some ideas on this.
There were caravans of merchants that traveled back and forth and bring messages.
Lots of, and that's what we were discussing today some. The merchants going one way and another. You wouldn't necessarily have to just wait for one party to get from another country, because they would cross paths with other travelers along the way, whether on land or at sea, and they would share their information. And by the time they arrived, then everybody's got that. Yes, Wes?
Well, the letters, there was some kind of communication done with letters. Paul, that's half the Bible.
Paul's writing a bunch of letters, isn't he? And sending them out by courier. And so I'm thinking the people in North Africa where he made contact there were able to get word to Philip, and probably Joseph and Philip had been in regular communication prior to this. You know, we just don't think about how well-traveled and what level of knowledge people had. To be able to arrange and keep a meeting like that is pretty big stuff. For us looking back on history, all those primitive people, they had no means of communication, no technology. They used what they had in pretty smart ways, and it worked pretty well for them. I'm going to read you just one of the portions I've got here. There's a wealth of uncontroversial testimony asserting Philip's commission in Gaul, or Philip's commission of Joseph in Gaul there in France, all of which alike state that he received and consecrated Joseph preparatory to his embarkation and appointment as the apostle to Britain. Converts literally flooded into Glastonbury, we might also know the place as Avalon of history, for conversion, for baptism and instruction and missionary assignment. Joseph was training people and giving them missionary assignments, just sending them out all over the world. Imagine that. Philip sent from Gaul alone 160 disciples to assist Joseph and his team with the crowds there. One of the first to go out from Glastonbury was Mary and Martha's brother, Lazarus. He headed straight back to Marseille, where he held the bishopric there for 7 years before being martyred for his faith. And so notice who was with Joseph at this time. But we don't have much in the Bible telling us about this. But we have first century written records that tell us about this, second century and third century, but literally contemporary writers giving us this very information. I went all my life, I went through 3 ministry degrees in theology and ministry without one mention of any of this at all. Not one mention. And again, as I was sharing with some pastoral colleagues, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, like, where are you getting this info anyway? And I was like, well, most of it you can find in an encyclopedia, really. And it's just history. It's not hidden. And that's what now there are some things that are disputed about how things happen one way or another, or what the actual relationship between two people might have been. You know, how some history can mess it up, especially when you have people with the same name and different family, all this, as we saw last week. But the majority of this is undisputed history. It's all there to just dig it up. I'll give you some more before we're done. Let's see, I've got a few minutes to go, so we're going to get a little bit of good stuff here. While there at Glastonbury, incidentally, it's believed that Jesus traveled to Glastonbury with Joseph more than one time during his years between, say, age 14 and age 30, and that he probably trained at one of the schools there. Those were the best. Julius Caesar trained there too, by the way. That was where the finest education was found. And most of those were schools that had been started a couple of generations earlier by the Druids, believe it or not. And many have said that Jesus approached the teaching, his way of reasoning, several things like that would indicate that he probably had a lot of exposure to those teachings. Some of the stories about Joseph and Jesus being there in the earlier years was that the craft they were on, the ship they were on, had ran aground because of a exceptionally low tide or low waters or whatever. They had to do some repairs. And while they were there, the two of them, they probably had help, built a mud and wattle building. And it was a place where they would pray and do this sort of thing. And many said that there was a congregation that actually met there after Joseph came back and started sharing the gospel. Joseph arrived back there about 37 AD, by the way. You got Jesus being crucified about 30 AD. Not 33 as you would expect, but more like 30. Why? Jesus was born not in AD 001, but in 3 BC. So there's a lot of math involved, and you got to get your dates and everything together, but when you add it up and put things where they belong, it does make sense. But at 37 AD is when Joseph arrived back there. It was, on his epitaph, or his headstone, was basically, after I buried the Christ, I went to the British Isles, I taught the gospel, and now I'll rest, basically, is what he had prepared to have written on that. And they apparently, sometime about 13th century, moved that. I believe that stone is still there at Glastonbury Abbey. I believe it rests there right now today. And some even claim they have Joseph's tomb there. I don't know. But there's a lot of history in that area, believe me. I forgot. Mr. Potter, could you do me a favor? I gave you a little video clip. Would you play that? This is a little bit random, but it's not off the track, I promise. Okay, before you start it, do y'all remember when I did the lesson on Joseph the Tin Man, that I had given you the words to a song? Joseph was a tin man. Will you play that now, Jim Potter? Here you go. It's like 3-4 minutes.
Joseph was a tin man, came far across the sea. He came to buy my tin, his nephew came with him, a lad from Galilee. I'd meet them at the quay, they'd always stay with me. Romans have no sway here, he always used to say. At home they kill for fun, hang men out in the sun, on crosses every day. That is the Roman way. All rebels they will slay.
Okay, you can cut it off there. You got the idea. Yes, sir.
I was just kind of curious as to whoever wrote the lyrics to that, they seem to be getting what you've been getting at.
It's not even that hidden. It's just all right out there.
So whoever wrote the lyrics, they were going by, quote, secular history, non-extra, non-biblical.
If you look up the traditions of Glastonbury, you'll discover a lot. Yeah, I mean, if you listen to the words to that, it's like somebody didn't just make this up. And no, it's pretty rich in historical reality, and it coincides pretty directly with all the other historical. I'm not really sure when that song was written. I was really surprised to find a modern performance of it, though, because it's old. It is way back there, you know.
They had the luxury of not having gone to a seminary.
Yeah, maybe so, where they didn't already know, yeah. But obviously, there's a lot of talk in that part of Britain about Joseph. He came to buy my tin. His nephew came with him. You know, all of those kind of things. Him saying that when I'm done with my work, I'm going to come back here. I love this land. He died there. They say he lived to be 100 years old. I haven't. I was really looking for something to disprove that, but I keep looking and they keep saying no. He lived to be 100 years old. So. Yeah, that was really old in his day. But let me, yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Who was the nephew? I know you told us.
His name's Jesus.
The man from Galilee.
The lad from Galilee. Joseph,
He did the, yeah, before. All
and he brought his nephew with him when he was coming there to buy tin.
had the life before, yeah.
Yeah, yep. Yes, Debbie.
Do you know how old Jesus might have been when he went with Joseph?
Well, I'm more convinced than ever that Joseph, the husband of Mary, died when Jesus was about 14. That's the best I can find on that. And so I am thinking Jesus at 14 was probably about ready to begin his higher education. You know, a lot of the privileged of that day would get into education pretty early on. I'm thinking he did a lot of traveling with his uncle, who wasn't a whole lot older than him. He was younger than Mary. And I can't prove, but I'm pretty sure it's a pretty safe bet that Jesus got a lot of advanced education and schooling there in Cornwall, in the Glastonbury area.
Is there a certain name for that school that Julius Caesar went to?
There were multiple universities there, all started by the Druids, and they had advanced rhetoric. They had advanced science and mathematics. Just a lot of integrated knowledge, and really all those universities were wiped out by Rome too. But the school that Joseph started there when he went back. And as you can see, they were sending people to him from all over. He was training people to fulfill the Great Commission. That's why I started this lesson by reading the Great Commission, by the way, just in case you didn't catch that. He was training people there and literally giving them assignments. Okay, you're going to South Africa, and just sending them out all over the world with the gospel. And of course, they were traveling, and many of them coming back bringing wealth of knowledge, books and parchments and all different kinds of writings. And they were going into that school and its library there, which continued to thrive up until right around 1100. And it was destroyed. Are y'all familiar or heard of the great Persian doctor and teacher of between 1000 and 1100 AD. Avicenna, or Ibn Sina would be his other name, Avicenna. He taught philosophy and especially surgery and medical procedures in Persia at a place called Isfahan. And there was a great school and library there. And when there was the more radical element of Islam really emerged, prior to this had been what they called the golden age of Islam, where the Islamic clerics were sending people out to collect books and works of scholarship, and they were just learning and collecting knowledge, the arts and sciences, and that's where Avicenna was really at the pinnacle of that. But when this radical element of Islam rose up, that they just despised the places of learning and knowledge, and they destroyed Avicenna's school at Isfahan and the library and all of that. And it was just a couple of decades later that the great school and library that had been founded in Britain there by Joseph, the Tin Man, Joseph, was destroyed by Rome in about 1100. So there was, I mean, that was really a time to bring in a lot of darkness into the world, where there had been, I can imagine the wealth of knowledge of the first 1,000 years of Christianity that was destroyed with that. And I would guess that there's probably some books and other documents and everything that were taken from that place and are hidden under lock and key somewhere in the Vatican right now even, because there's a ton of stuff like that that's hidden. Just the same, that was destroyed. But they were sending out missionaries and preachers like crazy out of there. So, time is, I got a few minutes. So, Joseph and several who accompany him go down to the place he'd been familiar with, where he had gone, to buy the tin and the lead, as they said in the song, all of that. And he had an audience with the king and the king's family. And we're told the first person he baptized there was King Caradactus' young daughter, Gladys. And then her brother and many others of the family, an aunt who, Pomponius was her name, and her original name had been Gladys, and Caradactus' daughter was named after her aunt. That gets to be an interesting story, so I'll try not to sidetrack on that. He shares the gospel with them, and then as we read, even Philip and others are sending hundreds there from France and other places either to help or to learn and train and go out. But some of his very first converts and baptisms there were the royal family. This is important stuff. King Caradactus, and you can find this in just about any direction of history you want to look. It's there. So I'm going to merge some things together to move it ahead. King Caradoc or Caradactus had resisted Rome valiantly, and you even notice in that song that they talked about how Rome has no sway here and that they are in rebellion to keep it that way. So it gives you a little bit of the idea of the time that was talking about, because that was the case. However, they eventually captured King Caradactus and took him to Rome. This was after Joseph arrived. This would have been around 42 AD. Okay. They took him to Rome. He made an incredible speech about the situation between Britain and Rome and his state and so forth, and everybody loved him. And they said, there's no way we're killing him. And they said, we're going to keep him in house arrest here in Rome for 7 years, then he can go back. But they also brought his daughter Gladys and his son Linus along to be there. And the building that they were assigned to stay in was called the Palatium Britannicum. As a matter of fact, y'all want to do some fun Google searching, spell it the way I spelled it there. Let's see, did I spell it with Palatium? and 1 T, 2 N's in Britannicum? Okay. Go ahead and do some, whatever you search engine you use, and just put in that name, Palatium Britannicum, and just search and look it up and see what you find. Just see what all you dig up from that. Now, the daughter and son of King Caradactus ended up there, and they ended up staying after the 7 years after he left. The escort that they had to take them to Rome when they all went was the aunt that I mentioned, Pomponius, had married a Roman officer. He was in charge of the detail to escort them to Rome. And there was another officer in that detail named Rufus Pudens. And he ends up falling in love with the king's daughter, Gladys. They were later married. I've got the date and the year of the marriage, but I don't have that right in front of me. We'll share that. We'll get to that later. Now, Gladys so impressed Emperor Claudius that he adopted her to be his daughter and renamed her Claudia. 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul mentions, he's writing to Timothy, he says, do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus greets you, and so do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters. The people he's discussing there, Claudia, also known as Gladys, the daughter of King Caradactus, her brother Linus, son of the king, and Claudia's husband, now the Roman senator, Rufus Pudens, who is also Paul's half-brother. I'm not kidding you. Okay, let me, just before we wrap up, I'm going to, grandfather of St. Paul was a wealthy Benjamite of Tarsus who purchased with a great sum Roman citizenship for himself and his family and had added a Roman name to his original Hebrew name. His son, Davidus, or the father of St. Paul, also assumed a Roman name, that of Appius Tullius. The latter's wife, St. Paul's mother, was a lady named Praxedes, and St. Paul confirms part of this when he claims to be a freeborn Roman citizen. Wilmhurst, the historical writer, further states that Davidus, Paul's father, took service in the Roman army and rose to the rank of centurion, in which capacity he was drafted into Palestine, or Israel as I would prefer to call it. He was the centurion who said to our Lord, "Speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed." He was he of whom the Jews said, "He loves our nation and has built us a synagogue." The ruins of a synagogue bearing both Roman and Jewish emblems have in recent years been excavated at Capernaum, showing that it was built by a Roman Jew. I'm going to go on. Okay. Same writer goes on to tell us that Davidus died, leaving St. Paul's mother, Praxedes, a wealthy widow at Tarsus. Then came Pudentius, the Roman senator, that's Rufus Pudens, on high civil, not military duty, and met Praxedes, whose wealth and education gave her a leading position in the city. This is the father of Rufus Pudens, okay? Pudentius. He meets Praxedes, the widowed mother of Paul. He married her and took her back with him to Rome. To them was born the Pudens that we referred to here, Rufus Pudens. And so we've got the whole family tree now of Paul, his mother, and the two different husbands, one who was the father of Paul, the other who was the father of Rufus Pudens. And that's when Paul, in the book of Acts, says to greet or salute Pudens and his mother and mine. It's the one reference in the Bible that tells us they were half brothers. But history also confirms that. So, again, sometimes it sounds like I'm crazy, but well, even if I am, it has no bearing on this. I'm just telling you. There is a gigantic story around this royal family being in Rome. Remember, Paul wrote the epistle to the Romans to a big, thriving, well-taught, well-learned, well-read congregation in Rome, and basically establishing his theological credentials to them, knowing he was going to come there and that he wanted them to accept him. He didn't plant a church there. Who was leading the church in Rome when Paul wrote this letter? We have no evidence Peter was ever there. Who was, I just told you guys. Claudia, Linus, and Pudens. It's all right. It's okay. I ask you the questions to get you to process, think through this. They were leading this church at basically the British embassy in Rome, Palatium Britannicum. That building is still there in one form or another. It is the Saint Pudenziana is the name of the building today. And it has had two other names historically before becoming that name, but it's held that name since 5th century, I think, something like that. But it was originally Palatium Britannicum. And that's where the church was. There's another small congregation that got started along about this time in Rome too, but these were Orthodox Jews from the synagogue there. Anyway, different story, different time. Paul arrives at Rome and he finds them, who's already been corresponding with, leading the church there. And he elected to at first live with his half-brother Pudens there. And of course, his new sister-in-law, who is a British princess, right? And Paul stays there at Palatium Britannicum for quite some time. And probably the prison epistles, that's where he wrote them. Pretty fancy place for all of us thinking he was in some dank old dungeon somewhere. Yeah, he had servants there, for crying out loud. Oh, absolutely. It's just like a foreign dignitary being in exile in an embassy in our country or that sort of thing. Again, these weren't destitute people. Yes.
So the Catholic Church has pretty much shoved all of this information down in the dungeon.
Well, actually, there's a great deal of this that they openly publish, but there's some things that kind of get shuffled aside. But the overall bulk of this, Catholicism doesn't deny. They have it published. But they'll be off on some things, like I said, like what's the relationship between Joseph of Arimathea and his sister Mary. They say, oh, no, he's not. They're not siblings. He's her uncle. Okay, there's some things like that where they'll be off. But the general substance of all of this, they don't deny. They publish it right along. They'll even tell the story there. If you go on a tour in Rome and visit the St. Pudenziana, they will tell you the historical story there and how that the British royalty lived there and led the church in the first century. They'll even share all that. And that Paul was there and his half-brother was married to Claudia, all of that. They got that.
I thought they claimed Peter.
Lots of people say that. And my new sources that I've got, I even got the first century writer, and he's doing his best to leave the door open for the possibility of Peter being there, but ultimately admits, I have no evidence that Peter was ever at Rome. He could have been, but he was not the founder of the church at Rome. We are told that although Linus and Claudia had already been leading that church and had grown it from nothing up to a few thousand people apparently, that after Paul arrived there, that Paul consecrated or commissioned Linus as the first bishop of Rome. And Linus is listed as the first bishop of the church of Rome. Yeah, crazy stuff, right? How did you know you were going to get all this just from going to church? Wes.
I don't want to get ahead, but if I am, just back off. How does a very Jewish Christian church become basically
Yeah, and this is something we'll try to get into because early Christianity was very Jewish flavored. In other words, the traditions, the practices, the ways of doing things came from Jewish Hebrew roots. Somewhere along the way, the modern church, the Gentile church of today, lost all of that, adopted a Roman calendar, Roman holidays, renamed many of those for certain Christian things or whatever, and now Christianity is very Roman flavored rather than Jewish or Hebrew flavored. And I can get into that in later studies.
Well, even renaming stuff, the descendants of these people, I mean, it didn't last. Did they all get killed, or, I mean,
Well,
there was so many, as you were saying.
yeah, there was great persecution that came against Christians in most of Europe. And, through the Dark Ages and the Spanish Inquisition, that wasn't just in Spain, by the way, so a lot of things like that. And so I'll try to, the last statement I put in the notes there was from Luke's writing in the book of Acts. Let me get this back up. So Paul was there more than this 2 years, but Luke says now, for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. So he moved out of Palatium Britannicum and had his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. So I'm saying that was a pretty well set up estate too. Again, the prison epistles, this is where they happen, guys. I think it's amazing that I was so wrong on almost everything for so long. It's pretty exciting when you find out. It is. Anyway, thanks, guys. Appreciate you coming. Well, it's incomplete. It's a start. I'll add to that. Yeah. By the way, this is Advanced Heresy 502. Your course schedule should say AH 502.